Hi, welcome to Detours Understanding Acquired Brain Injury. Today I want to talk to you about communications problems and traumatic brain injury, or acquired brain injury in general. The thing is, most of us are familiar with the standard kinds of aphasia: Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, transcortical motor, and sensory aphasia. You often see these strokes, but the thing is that it's not as common of a thing seen in just straight traumatic brain injury. The types of problems those of us with traumatic brain injury have actually relate less to motor programming and coordination and more to social communication. Research done by speech pathologists, things like that, and neuropsychology, cognitive neuropsychologists, show that the problems we have relate more to that level between speaking individual words and high level communications for focused purpose. That we have problems with those types of skills. So things like what's called anomic aphasia. So what is that? That's something most of us have problems with. And a lot of people with other neurological disabilities have a problem with. Anomic aphasia, I have a problem with that, and that's word finding. And while you hear that with a lot of other people, and even as you get older, we have a problem with this. Those of us with brain injury have this disorder in a lot more serious of degree. I'm having some of that problem right now, which is where I'm using a lot of uhs and ums because I'm having trouble finding exactly the right words. And I do tend to do these without a script, just based on what I know, my own research, readings, and me being in the field. But word finding is a big one. Specifically, we have problems with nouns and with names, things like that. And recalling specific instances, things along those lines. So anomic aphasia is one of them. The other one is people with traumatic brain injury do tend to repeat themselves a lot, and it's related to both memory and executive dysfunction. And this is another way in which a communication disorders for people with traumatic brain injury, their disorder tends to manifest itself in speech and communication. So yeah, we tend to repeat ourselves. So that's another characteristic of communications disorders. Another one is that we either tend to say very little, or we tend to be hyperverbal. So hypo or hyperverbal. So lots and lots of speech or very little. And the thing is, either side of this, it tends to be fairly devoid of content. So if you were to record just everyday conversation. And I'm not saying conversation intended for a purpose, because that requires concentration and attention. But if you're just sitting around with somebody who has traumatic brain injury and you listen, you sit there and talk with them, you'll find that if it isn't intentional and planned, it's fairly empty. It's just filler. Or they'll say virtually nothing at all, and you need prompting. And this, again, relates to executive deficits, problems with planning and problems with intentionality. And so also, they have problems, people with traumatic brain injury, we have issues with turn taking. We interrupt a lot. And so this social give and take, you'll see that that's a problem. We also tend to have trouble conveying clearly our emotions in speech. This is another element of social communication that becomes a problem. We may become angry and irritable quickly, and this will lead to conflict when speaking. And this is something that comes naturally to people without brain injury, but it has to be taught. And with understanding emotions conveyed in written language as well, people with traumatic brain injury, which is why something like Facebook or Messenger or whatever is texting difficult. And it's really why those kind of modes of communication are not preferable. It's why texting is really a hard way to communicate for a person with brain injury. They will often make mistakes and misunderstandings, especially of emotional content. So really, verbal is better despite the fact that it has problems, because at least we've evolved to understand prosody, speed of speaking, the emotional, the pitch changes, non-verbal cues, nods, head shakes, raised eyebrows, narrowed, inviting of lips or tilting of heads, things like that, that are not present in text. And oftentimes we have trouble differentiating between literal and non-literal communication. It's why jokes will go over our heads quite often, or we have problems with abstract meaning, again, an executive thing, and so won't laugh at jokes or tongue-in-cheek, and will often become defensive if we fail to understand something that's meant as a joke, and become reactive. So social communication is very critical, and yet we'll often miss it or ignore. And so really this is a significant disability that many of us have. And while the stroke type symptoms are more obvious, but also less frequent traumatic brain injuries, it's social communication which is most disabling in a person with traumatic brain injury, and requires practice, requires perhaps scripting of how to respond to certain situations, and requires explaining the situation, which is a verbal task, but does require that kind of attention and focus on executive deficits. So I just wanted to address some of the problems associated with traumatic brain injury and communication. And this is where speech-language pathologists can help, as well as neuropsychological cognitive rehabilitation, in order to address some of these problems. And families and friends being aware that it's not intentional, it is part of the disabilities that come with it, and some of the more disabling symptoms. Thank you, and hope you've had a good day. Bye.